this is Darwin's Day, an anniversary of Darwin's birthday, but it's also the 150th anniversary of Darwin's second great book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And this book was very controversial for two reasons. One, because of Darwin's views of human evolution. And, there's an interesting tie with he and Lincoln saving the same birthday. Darwin was also known as a renowned abolitionist. So he was very vocal against slavery. And part of the dissent is trying to make the argument that all races share a common ancestor. And that was kind of him bolstering that as a scientific argument against slavery. But then, of course, the second part of the book, and these are really two different books, was his idea of sexual selection. Now, sexual selection was not accepted as readily as natural selection was by his peers, and especially by Alfred Wallace, and also too by Huxley. And what they didn't like, Darwin suggested that there are two mechanisms of sexual selection. So sexual selection is favoring traits that enhance an animal's ability to acquire mates. And there's two ways to do this. It's usually males competing for females, and they can compete directly with one another, or they can sexually advertise to females, and females choose which male is going to mate. Now, the controversial part of that is that the traits that are used to attract females usually seem to be traits that would decrease the survivorship of the individual. So they are very costly. So Darwin was very drawn to this conundrum. He just wrote this book on natural selection. How can he explain the evolution of traits that are actually decreasing an individual's survivorship? So then now it seems quite simple. He suggested this idea of sexual selection. And what he was really saying is, there's multiple components to fitness. One important component is survivorship, and the other important component is reproductive success. And you can't reproduce if you don't survive. If you survive and you don't reproduce, or you don't help somebody else reproduce, in a Darwinian sense, you may as well be dead because you're not going to pass on your genes. So this book that I wrote, A Taste for the Beautiful, this is a quote from Darwin when he was trying to explain, well, why would females prefer males with these elaborate traits? And what Darwin suggested is that females have an aesthetic sexual preference. Now, he didn't explain why this was the case, but this is what he means by a taste for the beautiful. Now, one thing that we've learned in the past few decades is that if we really want to understand the evolution of these beautiful traits, we really need to view these traits through the eyes and the ears and the nares of the females that are making these choices. So we need to know what's going on in the female's head, as it were, in her brain when she makes these kinds of decisions. So instead of giving kind of an overview of sexual selection, I thought what I would do is walk through the research that we've been doing for quite a long time on sexual selection in this one species of frog, and show you how we're trying to bring together lots of aspects of the animal's biology to try to get an understanding of the evolution of sexual advertisement in this very, very simple little frog. Yes?
Could you turn the whole slides on the presentation mode?
So you're not seeing the slides?
We do, but it's on the review mode. Could you turn it on the slideshow mode?
Okay, so to pick up where we left off, so we've been studying this very small nondescript frog, or at least visually nondescript frog in Panama. It's the Tungra frog, Physalinus pustulosus. And he's blown up in this picture. He's only 30 millimeters long. And these are found in Panama. This picture on the top right. Is everything okay, Lisa? Okay. This picture in the top right shows Barrow, Colorado Island, which is a reserve run by the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. So we don't work on BCI now, but that's where these studies started. And the Smithsonian's been a huge supporter of us for quite some time. So these frogs are in Panama. They're found from the north of Veracruz, Mexico, down through Middle America, through the Darien Gap, and then they're in Colombia and the Llanos of Venezuela. And we study them all through their range. We've done a lot of phylogeography with these guys, but I'm going to talk about their mating system, their breeding system here. And like many frogs, they breed in the tropics. They breed during the rainy season, and they call in small pools of water. And the males congregate into choruses, or their equivalent to a birdlek. And the males call and call and call for females, and then the females come and choose their male. So the primary sexual display with the frog is the advertisement call. Now there's about 6,000 species of frogs, and almost all frogs have these long distance mating calls. And they're all different from one another. So these calls are species specific. And we also know a lot about how the brain recognizes the call of the conspecific. And what we want to know is, how does the brain recognize prefer the call of some males over other males? So I'm just going to give you a very short video clip here so you can get a feel for how acoustically chaotic these choruses can be. So there's a cacophony of these frogs calling and calling and calling. But what we want to do is I want to zero in on the call, because the call has some very interesting variation. Now the call has two parts. This is a whine. That's the first part of the call. The call always has a whine. And it can consist of only a whine, or the males can add these chucks to the call. And I know it's hard to parse these different components. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play these four calls: a whine with one chuck, with two chucks, and with three chucks. Now, if a male's calling by himself, he'll produce only a whine. Now you can go up to the male in the field and he'll be calling, ear, ear. And if you say to this male, ear, he'll respond to you. You don't have to be good at this. Anybody can do this. And the male says, ear, and then you can say, ear, and then the male will say, ear, and it's hard for a human to get them to add more than 2 or 3 chucks. But in the field, they add up to 7 chucks. Most of the calls, though, are 1, 2, or 3 chucks. They only add these chucks when they're in vocal competition with one another. So if you go to a chorus, all of the males will be making calls with chucks. This isn't a polymorphism. As far as we know, all males can make chucks. And we've studied 30 populations of these frogs from Veracruz down to the Llanos of Venezuela, and all of the populations are also able to add chucks to their calls. So one of the first questions that we want to ask is, why are the males making chucks? Well, since the advertisement call is used to attract females, the first hypothesis was males make chucks because it adds chucks because it makes them more attractive. So this is a real advantage to working with frogs, because you can very directly ask a female what sexual displays do you find more attractive? So we have a frog lab in Panama. We have a walk-in acoustic chamber, and these experiments are quite simple. You put a female frog in the middle of a chamber, put her under a funnel, you close up the doors, and then you observe them on a monitor under infrared light, and then you play them calls. And then what you see is that the frogs will go right to one of the speakers. So the first experiments that we did with these frogs is say, would they prefer a call with the chuck, a wine chuck to only a wine? And the answer is yes. And we have a very big sample size here, over 5,000. And we've done this experiment over more than 20 years. This graph shows the results for 9 years. So what we see here is that the females have a 5-fold preference for calls with chuck. Now this is pretty amazing because the male he has to make the wine first, and then all he does, he just adds a little burp at the end of it, and his sexual attractiveness goes up 500%. So if you think of us, what could we possibly do to ourselves to increase our sex appeal 5-fold? And if there were anything, how expensive would it be? For these guys, energetically, it does not cost anything to add a chuck. So we measured this quite a while ago. The rate of oxygen consumption during calling. And calling is expensive, but adding a chuck does not take any more energy. And we have now good biophysical models of what's happening in the larynx, and we understand why it shouldn't cost any more. So strong preference for a call with a chuck, and as I'll show later, they prefer calls with more chucks to fewer chucks. But then why do the males need to be coaxed to make a chuck? Why are they reluctant to add chucks to their calls? Energetically, it doesn't cost anything. But we had this question, again, early on, why don't males always make chucks? And here's the answer. So when males add chucks, it increases their attractiveness 5-fold, but it also increases their risk of bat predation 5-fold. So we can do the same experiments with bats, this frog-eating bat in a flight cage, that we can do with females. We can give the bats a wine versus a wine chuck, and again, they're 5 times more likely to go to the wine chuck than the wine, which is interesting because the females are looking for a mate while the bats are looking for a meal, but they both have the same preference for complex calls. So this formed a good foundation for us to start asking more questions about what's going on in the frog's larynx. That the ability to add a second syllable like this is unusual. So what's going on in the larynx of the male and what's going on in the brains of the female? So something really interesting, very simple is happening here. So a frog larynx is not that different from our larynx. There's vocal cords in both larynges. Air comes from the lungs. It flutters the vocal cords, and this produces sound. Now, what the Tundra frogs have, if you look at that red arrow, they have this fibrous mass that's an extension of the vocal cords, and it goes back into the bronchus, or what, it's not technically a bronchus, but it goes back into what's analogous to a bronchus, where the lungs are attached. And it almost totally occludes the airflow from the lungs into the larynx. And we've done experiments where we've been able to remove that fibrous mass from a live frog and have it call again. And when we do that, the chuck disappears. And we've also done, as I mentioned before, these biophysical models. So what we see is that there's 2 components of these calls. that are produced by two separate morphological characters, the vocal cord and the fibrous mass. So the fibrous mass results in this chuck at the end of the call, and the vocal cord produces this whine. Now, this modularity even continues into the inner ear. So frogs, unlike us, frogs have two inner ear organs. We have a cochlea. They have two separate ones, the amphibian papilla and the basal papilla. The amphibian papilla is sensitive to lower frequencies. The basal papilla is sensitive to higher frequencies. And this has been examined in many species, and the tuning, the sensitivity of these end organs match the frequency characteristics of the call. So here, the dominant frequency of the whine is about 700 hertz, and the tuning of the amphibian papilla is about 700 hertz. The dominant frequency of the chuck is about 2500 hertz, and the tuning of the basal papilla is pretty close to that, about 2300 hertz. And the way we obtain those data with my colleague, Walt Wilczynski, you do electrophysiology. So you put electrodes in the eighth nerve going from the inner ear to the brain, and you can characterize the tuning of these two end organs. So it seems that one of the reasons that the chuck might be preferred by females, because only when the males add a chuck are you simultaneously stimulating both of these inner ear organs. Now, we followed the inner ear into the brain. A postdoc of mine a few years ago, Kim Hoke, did a number of studies on immediate early gene expression. And these genes are expressed in the brain where there's neural activity. So one can play different kinds of calls to females, sacrifice the females, then identify where there's been immediate early gene expression, and then you can see how much activity there is in different parts of the brain. So what we see is that in the auditory nucleus, there's enhanced responses to conspecific calls over heterospecific calls and complex calls over simple calls. And then when you go to the sensory motor system, in areas where decision-making is made, such as in some areas of the hypothalamus, we also see coding, population coding for these more attractive calls. And that information is then fed forward to the motor system, where we also have evidence for enhanced neural responses. So we think we have a pretty good understanding of how the brain is decoding this information, feeding it forward, and then generating this phonotaxis behavior in the females when where they select their males. So we've done a lot of work on the brain and how it influences mate choice. But then a lot of the other questions that we had weren't about the mechanisms of mate choice in the females. We're falling more into the area of cognitive biology than neurobiology. So we stopped doing these neurobiology experiments for a while to start doing some experiments in cognitive biology, and that's what I want to talk about now. So when females are choosing males of any species, they're doing some kind of a comparison. They're comparing one individual to another individual. So I want to do a little exercise here. I'm going to show you two clouds of dots. And I would like you to raise your left hand if there's more dots on the left, and your right hand if there's more dots on the right, okay? You can't count. This has to be a Gestalt thing. Okay, left or right? Okay, so most people see right away that there's more dots on the left. Good. And there's one more dot on the left than the right. Okay, ready? Another one. So the latency to respond of you guys It's a little bit longer now. Most of you get it right. There's one, again, one more dot on the left than on the right. Okay, we're going to do this once more. Yeah, that's a lot tougher, isn't it? Well, there's still one more dot on the left than there is on the right. But what we see is that the more dots in total, the more difficult it is to discriminate the magnitude of the number of dots in each cloud. Now it ends up that this discrimination is we're making this discrimination based on proportional differences rather than absolute differences. And this is well known in humans. It was discovered in humans by Weber in the late 1800s. And he came up with Weber's law. And Weber's law says that when we compare magnitudes, and literally we, because this is a human psychophysics study, when we compare magnitudes, that the greater the magnitude, the greater the difference between the two stimuli need to be for us to be able to discriminate them. There is a constant K, which equals delta I, the difference between two stimuli, divided by the magnitude of one of the stimulus, and that is Weber's law. So what that predicts is that as the sexually selected traits get larger in magnitude, as the peacock's tail gets larger, for it to make a difference to the female, the difference between him and his competitor needs to be even greater to achieve this constant proportion that the females need to tell them apart. So we wanted to know, do any animals follow Weber's law when they're doing mate choice comparisons? So the Tungra frogs are a good system for this because, as I showed you, females prefer calls with chucks to calls without chucks, but they also prefer more chucks to fewer chucks. So he asked a simple question: are the females making these comparisons based on absolute difference in the numbers of chucks? If they are using absolute differences, then the strength of the preference between 6 and 5, let's say, and 4 and 3, and 2 and 1 should be the same. And by the strength of the preference, we mean at a population level. So the probability that a female would prefer more chucks. If, on the other hand, they're following Weber's law and they're making the decisions based on proportional differences, the ratios of the number of chucks, then what we should see is that the preference for 2 chucks versus 1 chuck should be much stronger than the preference for 6 chucks versus 5 chucks. So we did 9 separate experiments where we contrasted 2 calls that varied in the number of chucks. These are all synthetic stimuli, so all the whines in the chucks are identical. They only vary with the number of chucks, to ask if the females are following Weber's law or if they're making absolute comparisons. And so what we see here is on the y-axis is the proportion of females in the experiment, each dot is an experiment, that preferred the call with more chucks. And the sample sizes for each of these experiments is roughly around 40. So in the top graph, we plot the difference in the numbers of chucks between the 2 stimuli and the strength of the female preference, the proportion of females in the experiment that preferred more chucks. And what we see is that the absolute difference in the number of chucks doesn't explain a significant amount of the variation. The coefficient of variation is, the correlation coefficient squared is only 0.12. So chuck difference is only explaining 12% of the variation in the female preference. But when we plot the chuck ratio, we see a very strong relationship between the ratio of the numbers of chucks to the female preference for chucks. So here the coefficient of determination is 0.84. So the ratio in the numbers of chucks is explaining 84% of the variation in the female preferences for chucks. So this is a very tight Weber distribution. So this leads to the question then, why are the females using Weber's law? There's two general possibilities. One possibility is that it's a cognitive constraint. This is the way that vertebrates compare magnitude, and it's a domain general function, and it did not evolve in the context of mate choice. That's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that this is a mate choice rule of thumb that evolves because of honest signaling. So for instance, it could be that the difference in quality of males that are making 2 versus 1 chuck is much greater than the difference in males that are making 6 versus 5 chucks. It might be that quality doesn't increase linearly, that it increases proportionally. So how do you test these hypotheses? We tested a number of the hypotheses of the honest signaling and rejected them. But with hypotheses of adaptation, you can always think of another reason why the females are doing that. So we thought the way to really get at this is to look at cognitive constraints. And now the bats come in as a wonderful way to test this hypothesis of a general cognitive constraint, because the bats prefer calls with chucks, as I showed earlier. And we didn't know this for a fact, but we thought that the bats would also prefer calls with more chucks. So we did the experiments. This is Rachel Page. She's a former PhD student of mine, but now she's a scientific staff member at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. So Rachel conducted the same experiments with the bats. So if we look on the top right, the difference in the number of chucks only explains 8% of the variation in the bat's response. The ratio of chucks in the bats explains 74% of the variation. And these two functions, the red one for the bat and the green one for the frogs, are statistically indistinguishable from one another. So the bats are responding to this variation in a Weber-like manner, just like the frogs are. And I'm not going to go into it now, but you can imagine this can have important implications for the evolution of sexually selected traits. What we normally think of is as the magnitude of a trait increases, like the peacock's tail, it increases in length, that's going to be halted by natural selection due to costs of evolving more elaborate traits. What we see here is there might also be a cognitive brake that's put on these traits, because you have to increase the magnitude of the traits so much more to make a difference to the chooser. Now, when we talk about animals choosing mates, we need to remember that this is taking place in a chorus, in what we can think of as a sexual marketplace. Now, we make decisions in marketplaces all the time. And in behavioral economics, they know an awful lot about how we make decisions. So one assumption of in humans in economic rationality is that the relative preference between two products. So here, frog A versus frog B, that relative preference should stay the same whether or not this third option is there, okay? Now we know that humans violate this assumption of economic rationality quite frequently. And here's a really good example. So when online subscriptions were first starting, The Economist had this offer. You could purchase an online subscription for $59. You could purchase a print subscription for $125, or you could purchase both for also for $125. So this person, Dan Ariely, asked students at MIT what their preferences would be. 16% said they would publish the online subscription. 84% would purchase the print and the online subscription. And, you know, MIT, these are smart kids. None of them are going to fork over $125 to get only the print subscription when they can get both for $125, right? So nobody wants the print subscription alone. So then you run the same experiment again, and you say, which subscription would you prefer? But you take away the print subscription, since nobody wants it anyway. And now the preferences have flipped. 68% of the respondents said that they would purchase the online subscription, and now only 32% would publish the print and the online subscription. So this violates this idea of this assumption of rationality that's called regularity. And in this scenario, the print subscription would be called a competitive decoy. It's not preferred by the consumer, but it has an important effect on how we assign utility, how we assign value to these different products. Now, economists have known about this for a long time, and they use competitive decoys when they distribute products on shelves in supermarkets and camera stores. So they use these competitive decoys sometimes quite effectively. Well, what about the frogs? So this is one of my former grad students, Amanda Leah, and we asked the question, are these frogs rational when the females choose their males, or more specifically, is there any evidence for this competitive decoy effect? So what we do is we take 3 natural calls, which we already measure the relative attractiveness of. So we've sampled many calls in the population, and we've done round robin experiments to show the relative attraction of calls. So these are taken from that database. We ran all of the basic phonotaxis experiments to measure attractiveness, and we got exactly the same results that we had gotten 10 years before. And then what we do is we vary the call repetition rate of these calls. So females prefer faster calls to slower calls, and some of these calls are acoustically more attractive than other calls. So we have these 2 dimensions of attractiveness, the inherent acoustic attractiveness and the call rate. So we just plot these here. And we start off by running a simple binary experiment where we give the females a choice between call A and call B. We test 40 females in each situation. We rotate those 2 calls randomly amongst these 3 speakers. And what we see is that the females don't have a preference. The majority of females are attracted to call B, but it's not a statistically significant difference. So now we run the same experiment, but now we have call C entered. So they're getting calls from the 3 speakers. We rotate them, the calls amongst the speakers in each experiment, and look what happens. Now we get a significant preference for call A. The females don't like call C, but now they're making a decision and they're preferring A, even though the majority of the females preferred B when we did just the binary experiment. So this shows very clearly that these frogs are not acting in what economists would call a rational way, and specifically that there's a competitive decoy effect here. So what that really means in nature is that it's very difficult. We can bring the animals in like we do all the time, and we can ask what the preferences are of females, but how that translates to mate choice in the wild becomes a little problematic, because even the calls of the individuals are going to be very strongly affected by other individuals in the sexual marketplace. Now, when it comes to modeling the evolution of traits and preferences, it becomes very difficult. So first, the cognitive break threw a hiccup into mathematical models of trait preference evolution. And now this makes it even more difficult. So the last phenomenon that I want to talk about has to do with multimodal communication. And we're inspired to do this study by an old paper that was in Nature with the wonderful title of Hearing Lips and Seeing Voices. And this is now called the McGurk effect. So the experiment is quite simple and quite elegant. So what they do is they have a video where a person is speaking the phonemes da, da, da. But the lips, I'm sorry, they're saying ba, 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 but the lips are moving ga, ga, ga. What does this test subject hear? You would think they would hear either gaga or baba, but they don't. They hear da-da. So there's this emergent percept of a sound of a phoneme that's not being produced, but comes about because of the interaction of the visual cue, the lips moving, and the sound that we're hearing. Now, frogs don't have lips. They keep their mouths shut when they call. Well, where does all that air go? Well, it goes down these vocal slits in the bottom of the mouth and it fills up this vocal sac. And then after the call, the vocal sac contracts and it shoots all of that air back into the lungs. So, frogs don't have a diaphragm. So we have negative pressure breathing. Our diaphragm moves down, there's pressure differential, the air rushes in. Frogs basically have to swallow, buccal pumping it's called. So the vocal sac evolved as a mechanism to make calling more efficient. But it does serve as a visual cue, just as our lips do. Our lips did not evolve, right, to send information about words, about phonemes, but it's a visual cue that we as receivers can exploit. And the same thing with females. So on the right here, my collaborator, Ryan Taylor in the back. He was a postdoc at the time, but we're still working together. And this is Barrett Klein and Joey Stein, the people who made these robo-frogs for us. So the robo-frogs are synced to a compressor. And so you have a vocal signal that's coming out of the computer. It's split to going to a speaker and then going to a compressor. And the vocal sac inflates and deflates coincidentally with the call. So we see here on the top row, these are real frogs. And on the bottom row, these are the robo-frogs. So I always make a little public service announcement when I get here. So those vocal sacs, when we first started doing this, we started to use condoms, but they broke like after 2 or 3 inflation cycles. So we use catheters for our urethra catheters now, which will last a little bit longer than the condoms, but the condoms are really fragile. They just broke right away. So this is what it really looks like in the lab. And you see the females respond to these. They go over to the males that are calling. So, one of the first questions that we ask are, if you give the female 2 identical calls, but one is associated with the frog with the vocal sac inflating and deflating, does that make the call more attractive? And the answer is yes. So if we look at the top graph, there's no robo-frog in the top graph. And we're comparing the wine chuck to the wine. And as we found for decades now, there's a very strong preference for the wine chuck. So whenever we do a new kind of experiment, we always repeat what are the foundational findings are for those experiments. So we think we know that they're always going to prefer the wine chuck to the wine, but since this is a kind of a different experiment, we redo those results, and again we get the same answer. Now, if you have the robo frog associated with a wine chuck, and you're comparing a wine chuck to a wine chuck, the one that has the visual cue, the vibrating vocal sac associated with the call, then that makes it much more attractive. Okay? Now we know from previous experiments that you can move the chuck across the wine and farther in time away from the wine. And at some point, the females stop merging the wine with the chuck, and they treat it like just a wine. So that's about 500 milliseconds. So usually the chuck immediately follows the wine, but if you move the chuck 500 milliseconds away, the females treat it like it's just a wine, as you can see here. So then we wanted to know, and again, being inspired by this McGurk effect, what happens if we move the visual cue away from the call? So what we see here is that if you have the wine chuck, and you have the vocal sac vibrating, but now it vibrates when the call ends. And if you compare that to the same call without the visual cue is no longer perceptually bonded with the call. It doesn't make the call more attractive anymore. In fact, it makes the call less attractive. We don't know why, but my guess is that the females hear the call stopped, and now they see something moving. And to them, maybe it's more likely to be a predator, a snake, than it is to be the call. Then we wanted to know, well, what would happen if we filled in this gap above, this 500 millisecond gap? What about if we move this vocal sac into that gap? How would the females respond to that? So if there's a phenomenon called auditory continuity, and in these frogs, if these frogs were behaving like humans, and if you had the wine and then the gap in the chuck, if you fill that gap with white noise, then the females would put the chuck together with the wine. The Chungra frogs don't do that. We've done that experiment. They don't do that. But we wanted to know if you could restore the salience, the potency of this wine gap chuck by putting the visual signal in there. And what we found is that the answer is yes. So if you have the wine and then the vocal sac and then the chuck, that's more attractive than the wine and the gap in the chuck. And then you can say, well, how much more attractive is it? Well, when we compare that wine vocal sac chuck to the wine chuck, then what we see is that it's as attractive as the normal wine chuck. So here's a signal that these females never experience in nature. And we see that this is as attractive as a normal chuck. So we call this perceptual rescue. And what it says to us is that there's just so many ways that males can be attractive to females in traits that don't exist now. And this is what we call sensory exploitation, where males can evolve traits for pre-existing female biases. And we do know, I didn't go through the evidence, we do know that that's how the chuck evolved, because we can show that the tuning that favors the chuck existed many millions of years, at least 15 million years before the chuck evolved. And this is another example of this type of sensory exploitation. So what we see now is that when Darwin suggested that there is this taste for the beautiful, we see these kinds of things happening in many animals where females can have preferences for a whole variety of traits that are influenced socially, that are influenced by cognitive constraints in how we compare signals, and are also influenced by the pre-existing preferences that, that females might have. So in this book, A Taste for the Beautiful, we go through I go through many kinds of examples of how these domain general effects of the brain influences the kinds of traits that we, as well as other animals, find attractive. So I always need to be sure that I thank the many interns that we've had over the decades. Thank the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute for supporting this research for so long, the National Science Foundation, and also my institution at the University of Texas.